So this video is for beginners really. It's a sort of introduction to line and wash and what line and wash really is. Now for most people who are starting to get back into sketching or getting into sketching, they'll be familiar with, you know, the sort of principles of line work, and they'll be familiar with what watercolour is, but they might not know how to sort of combine those things in such a simple and an easy way. So here I'm going to be talking you through the principles of line and wash, and how with a fountain pen, a brush and a little bit of watercolour you can create really beautiful scenes. So this is what I would call like a process video. So I'll be talking you through the decisions I'm making step by step, and you can get a kind of feel for line and wash as a process. And I'm rambling. So yeah, I'll chat you through it as we go. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed here that I'm doing something I don't normally do, and that is using a pencil. Now, whenever I'm doing teaching or workshops, I tend to really suggest that people don't use pencils. Now, one of the reasons why that is kind of watching my daughter really. She's, from a young age, I mean, she's nearly 9 now, but from a young age, she would get the pencil out and she'd draw a line, and it wouldn't be right the first time, so she'd rub it out, and then she'd draw a line and rub it out. And you could see her even before she got through the construction stage of a drawing getting more and more demoralised, and I'd see her little heart breaking and it'd break mine. And so I'd purposely, you know, like say to her, just get a pen and make loads of lines and don't worry about making mistakes. And then once you choose a line that you like, get a bigger pen and reinforce that line. So we ended up with pages of scribbles. And it's interesting how I've sort of used that technique for portraits in the past, and it just works really well, and it really frees you up. So why am I using a pencil here? Well, I've never drawn a grader before. This is what this machine is. And I wanted to vaguely get the perspective right, because I know if you don't know what a grader is or what that machine does, you won't give two hoots about whether the perspective is right or the proportion is right. But here's a confession. I have a background in industrial design, and I used to draw things like tractors and combine harvesters and all sorts of machines. Not half as well as my old boss, but that's another story. And that was kind of a little bit of my job. Now often I would be drawing them in terms of like applying graphics on them and things like that, but they had to look vaguely like the machine because the client were the people who made the machine. So you couldn't really mess about and, you know, draw the wheels twice as big and stuff like that. So I'll probably freestyle, you know, the French canals, or freestyle a sketch of Mont Blanc. But when it comes to drawing machines, I do get a bit overly critical of my own abilities, if that makes sense. So for this one, I've decided to break the rules, my own rules. I mean, that's the point of having your own rules, isn't it? You can just break them. And so in terms of taking this drawing from here's the reference to here's the sketch, let me just give you a couple of pointers to how I actually plan that out on the paper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose an area of the paper that represents the size of the screen in this case, because I'm using the reference drawing. So I'm going to say that I'm going to fill up from the far left hand side of the page to vaguely about halfway along the right hand side. I'm going to sit the painting sort of primarily on the left, if that makes sense. One of the other things I'm going to do is I'm going to try not to fill the whole page, because I often think that that just looks slightly more constrained and slightly more considered and slightly less fun, to be honest with you, than when you leave a lot of white space around a picture, let it breathe. So before I start the pencil sketch, typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what's right in the middle of the image, what's right in the middle of the screen on the reference drawing, and that's going to be this point here. So about halfway up the line of the cab and about halfway along the grader. So from there I can not only get some other reference points like the height of the roof halfway up the cab of the grader, but I can actually sort of construct out, if you know what I mean. Now this one's quite simple really, because if you split it into sort of vertical quarters back to the reference drawing, you can see we have the cab, the sort of middle, roughly the top of the barn that's falling down on the left hand side. Another thing that's quite interesting about this is we can almost split it up into thirds. If we look at it horizontally, we have the top of the cab and the roof are roughly together. The bottom of the wheels and what is sort of like the horizon is roughly a third of the way down. Top of the cab a third of the way up. So we can just sort of break it down into simple proportions. Do note these are construction lines. This isn't the drawing. The drawing is going to be done with pen, with my fountain pen. So the pencil stage is just like saying this blob here is going to be the house, this blob here, or the barn, is going to be the grader, there's the cab, here's the wheels, and things like that. So do be mindful of not doing too much drawing in pencil if you're going to do a sort of construction drawing. Keep it quite rough because you want the fountain pen work here to be expressive. You want this to be a little bit free and not too constrained by the underdrawing, if that makes sense. So we're onto the back wheels now, and again I'm doing the same thing that I did for the front wheels there. Now you may have spotted that the back wheels are a tiny bit bigger than the front wheels, and like I said before, I like to try and get things vaguely right for vehicles, but I didn't nail it here. It doesn't really matter. So what I'm trying to do is a suggestion of grips rather than drawing every single grip. And again, that's a way that I really like to approach my sketching, is come up with visual shorthands for things, in the same way that, you know, if you were doing oil painting, you'd use big brush strokes to suggest smaller details and things like that. So we're going to go and put a few more details of the grader in, and then we're really going to be working on this bit of the ground here. There's a real temptation with line and wash drawing to see a bit of white space and think, oh, I have to put some lines in there. Well, you really don't. And that is one of the real beautiful things about line and wash as a process. And I think as a beginner, it can take quite a long time to appreciate where you can have negative space, where you can just have white space. But also at this stage, because it's a two-stage process, so you have your line and then your wash, then it's hard as a beginner to be in that situation where you think at this stage, oh, I'll leave that, because that only comes through experience, where you can say, oh, well, I'll do that bit with paint and I'll do that bit with line. But as I say, that comes from experience. And actually, interestingly enough, looking at a lot of other people's work and thinking about what you like and thinking about what you're not so keen on. Now, choosing what colours you're going to use is a really personal thing. And it can depend completely on your mood or the style that you want to be portraying. You know, sometimes monochrome can work really well. Sometimes you want to be using some quite poppy colours and you want a really interesting kind of like almost like over the top colour scheme. But here with this line and wash drawing, I'm trying to achieve a sort of semi-realistic look, but I also want it to have some little interesting colour pops. I don't want it to be too flat, because the grader itself, the machinery itself, has got that lovely colour pop in it, and some of that rust is just such a beautiful colour. I want to try and keep a little bit of that dynamic in the machine itself. So what I'm starting to do here is, normally actually I'd start with the sky, but what I'm doing here is the ground. Now, one of the really lovely things about watercolour is you can mix it together. So as a medium, it has this wonderful ability when wet to sort of merge in with itself. So you don't often have to just mix it in the pan and put a single layer in. So rather than mixing it in the pan and putting a single colour in, what I'm doing is I'm choosing to wet the ground area, putting a little bit of blue, I've put in a little bit of transparent red oxide, which is a sort of orange colour. I'm dropping in there a bit of quinacridone gold, and I'm using quite a big brush, and I'm being quite splodgy. And that is a really fun way of working with watercolours. So I'm mixing up a little bit of grey, and I'm going in, it's a bit dry that, so I'm going to wet my brush a bit. And go in and just put a single layer of that grey just right over the top of that barn. What I'm doing here is purposefully not minding if one area touches another area and it sort of bleeds across. That's not something that bothers me, particularly at this stage. I don't want to have necessarily loads of crisp edges. What I'm trying to create here is some form of like underpainting, if you know what I mean. See, I'm adding in a little bit of green here, which you don't actually see on the barn, but I'm putting that in just sort of break up those flat areas, to try and almost create a sort of distressed vibe, really. So I've mixed up a little bit of flat blue here. What it is it's a bit of cobalt blue, it's a bit of French ultramarine, and I've added in a little bit of Van Dyke brown, and that's just sort of knocked out the pigment a little bit so that it's a little bit muted, because if you look at the original drawing here, it is a kind of winter sky. It's not a poppy summer sky. There is a few clouds in it, but I want the enough blue to sort of pop with the yellow on the machine, but I still don't want it to be too crazy, too bold. No, I have a lot of fun with this, guys. I do some weird and odd things, and I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I don't really care. Because it's so absorbent, it will stay wet for a long time. So I've mixed up a little bit of grey here, and I'm putting in some grey for the tyres. There's going to be a few layers on that. I typically do sort of 2 or 3 layers on tyres because, you know, there are some highlights and lowlights on tyres, and you want to try and express the fact that they are a 3D shape. I think it really adds to the character of the vehicle. If you have little dots of colour like grass and things like that, I'll often use a spattering technique. And again, this is a lovely shorthand. It's a kind of a truncated way of saying here's some little bits of grass growing. It's nice and quick as well. I'm just basically doubling down and adding in some bigger blobs here right in the very foreground, which perhaps is a little bit excessive because I'm losing a little bit of that lovely white space that I left underneath the grader there. So before I go and put any more sort of patina on the machine, I can paint in the main colour of the machine, which is yellow in this case. And then because, you know, you make orange from red and yellow as a sort of base layer, you can actually paint the rusting afterwards. So what you can do is pretty much paint most of the machine. Well, not most of the machine, but, you know, most. So technically you could paint all of the machine that was originally yellow and then just add the rusting afterwards. Hope that makes sense. Dabbing in some areas of that bright orange colour there. And I'll let that move around a little bit, and then I'll go back in later and put a more sort of accurate layer of rusting that has harder edges. So you have sort of soft rust and hard rust, if that makes sense. So the next stage to this really is just to build it up a little bit. I mean, I think the wheels were done a while ago now, so they'll be dry enough to put another layer in. So I'm just going to build up some of the darker areas. I'm looking at the machine here, look at the reference drawing and see those areas where we have some really dark shadow. So the shadow under the wheels there, you can see that's still a little bit wet because it's blooming a little bit. And I'm looking at other areas, there's a lot of shadow in the engine compartment there, but because the paint's still quite wet, it's just sort of getting a bit soft. So I might go back in and putting in some shadows once it's a tiny bit drier. So as you can see from the original line work there, I didn't put in things like the tree that was growing out the top of the barn. I didn't want to overcomplicate things. It's nice to keep things a little bit simple. But what I am going to do is I'm going to sketch in with the paintbrush some of these trees, and then look at where some of these shadow details are. Now, a lot of this junk that I've put in here in the foreground kind of isn't there weirdly in the original, but I just wanted a sense of a junkyard, you know, some bits of abandoned metal. And the blob that was in the reference drawing is actually, it's quite difficult to understand what it is. I mean, I think it's probably a pile of mud with some bits on top. But I wanted some more junky, rusty kind of bits there. So here I'm using a rigger brush. I think this must be one of the rare days that I get all my brushes out for a play. And I'm doing some more branches. And then I'm going back in and adding in some of the dark areas behind the machine that I've for some reason left strangely white. So I'm adding in some of the final details here on the cab. We have the wing mirror. The wing mirror, it's not. it's a cab mirror. And some of the shadow details, one of the things that I often think that makes machines or anything that's a polygon look more realistic is when you start to add things like shadows and form into it, you know, because then it actually looks like a real thing. So here I'm using a brush, a small brush again, and I'm trying to show the fact that the cab has overhang. You know, the cab goes over those drive wheels at the back, so that you get a more feel for the actual shape of it in reality. If you look at the reference drawing, there is quite a strong shadow under there. And I'm also looking at the shadows around the engine area. There's an awful lot of shadows there as well. It's actually pretty dark. So those are going in now, and then from there I can go and add in some of the really dark shadows that are in the grille on the back. Now, third layer, no less, on those wheels. It's interesting that watercolour is one of those media that really just benefit from layering and taking your time. And it's very easy to want to rush it, particularly when you're, you know, working in quite a fast pace with sort of line and wash or urban sketching style. It's very easy to think that you can really just do it in one, but actually I always find that there's at least 3 layers in most of the watercolour sketches I do, unless it's one of those exercises where can you do it in 2, or like a 5-minute quick sketch or something sort of novelty like that. Most of the time it's at least 3 layers. So here I'm using a thin brush again. I am adding in a little bit of detail on those tyres. Again, if you look at the reference drawing, you can see that we have a little bit of shadow on the side wall there, and where the treads are, particularly towards the back, where we know we're going to put a little bit of shadow in, there's definitely going to be some more shadow in there. So often what I'll do is I'll take it away, give it a hair dry, and then come back and have another think. Actually, at this stage, I might well leave it for a couple of days and come back fresh, and then think about it with a lot more of a fresh approach. And it may be that I leave it, or it might be that I actually do quite a lot more. Often adding in a little bit of extra line work adds interest to a picture, but it also, particularly if you use slightly thicker lines, it'll also make a subject a little bit more prominent. It gives it a little bit more value. I love lines. I know it sounds really weird, but I love the combination between the flat colours and the colours that all blob and merge together, and then the crisp line. I think there's something in that I just love. And for all that I have tried to be a pure watercolourist in the past, and I've tried my hand at gouache, and I've tried my hand at lots of different types of line work and paint combinations, I think if I had to be anything, I would primarily be a line artist. In other words, I'd forego watercolour if it meant I could keep my lines, but I wouldn't forego my lines. So I'm adding in some thicker lines, mainly around the sort of external area of the grader here. Less of a line thickness on top, because that's actually going to be lighter. And normally in areas that are in shadow, I'm going to be adding in slightly thicker lines underneath that muffler there, but not on top. So here I'm trying to 5930. So here, this line here is really trying to show that there's a grill there, so it's got a little bit of form to it. So I'm also going to put a line in here around these tyres here, just to pull them forward a little bit away from the vehicle to show that they're not, you know, tucked under, they're proud. So the final stage here is to put in a few highlights with my gel pen just on some of the treads, but there's not really a huge amount to do. I mean, looking at this now from, you know, I actually painted this a couple of weeks ago. I could have put a little bit more shadow on the right hand side of that grille, and I could have put a bit of shadow on the back of the cab, because I don't think that form is truly shown enough. I could do a little bit more with that. So in the true measure of honesty here, I'm actually revisiting this sketch because there's a few things that I thought I could add, that I could show you. So one of the main things I want to do is add in a little bit of this Van Dyke Brown to a little bit of the natural sienna, and I want to add in a little bit of shadow here. And I also want to add in some of that there and there. No, I just feel it was in need of something there, and I also want to add that in on the back there. Now I know I'm going to lose a little bit of that lovely texture, but I think for the sake of reality, it's going to look a little bit better with a bit of that there, like that. Now I'm not running that up into that grey. Screwed up there a bit. There we go. You might actually just make that a tiny bit darker there as well. I think that helps on that side, certainly. You could add in a little bit more shadow under these areas. Another thing I thought about here was in here, you know, behind some of these components, and also under here. But I'm in danger of fiddling here, I think. So there we go. And that just helps a little bit. And one of the other things I was going to do is I was talking previously about doing leaves or very, very fine branches as sort of watercolour. Now I'll show you what I mean by that. So say for example we have some branches here and you wanted to show those, not draw every specific one. What you can do is just do a sort of suggestion of them. Like this. And using that dry brush technique, sort of something like that. So I'll mix up a little bit more of that, which is quinacridone rose. Tiny bit of transparent red oxide, and then a little bit of that French ultramarine, and you're going to get this kind of purpley colour. So again, I'll pick up a little bit of that and then start in here. Go through there, and then as the brush dries off, just drag it up. There we go. Adding a little bit more darker there, and then for the sake of harmony, what I might do is just do some quick on the other side there. That working quite quickly, and just add that in there. As you can see, I'm being a little bit rough with this, but it doesn't matter. There we go. So that gives a sort of suggestion of foliage without being overly specific or prescriptive. There we go. So I think the final piece looks great. I'm really pleased with that. I like this in the background. I think this is fun. The extra shadow detail that just went in there, I think just helped make that pop a little bit, because that's the main focus. You kind of want to come over here in your eye, move around here too much, but you don't want too much detail or contrast over there, because primarily this guy's the hero here, this amazing grader. There is some decals that I could kind of draw on there with a fine liner, but there's no point. I like it as it is. So yeah, happy with that. I hope you guys enjoyed that too, and as ever, there's going to be a longer version on my Patreon and a shorter version on YouTube, so you guys get to see it too, and I hope you enjoyed that.